Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. Unfortunately, no one believed the words of a poor girl named Inez. She claimed she hadn't killed her husband, but nobody cared. And the room here, in which she was accused of brutal murder, was more like a stage that had been set up to prove her crime. One of the men who appeared for the prosecution said the girl claimed she would sort things out with her husband and get back together with him. Another man talked about how Inez was dissatisfied with her husband all the time, so she had a clear motive to kill him. Also, some unknown man for the girl said that she had a small mole on her thigh and wondered if that would be enough to prove their intimacy. All the men who could be present in that hall claimed in unison that she was a harlot. One of the salesmen who came to testify said that Inez had bought butter from their shop that day and had left afterward, and he had not seen her. Another woman, however, who was just passing by on the street, said she saw the two of them and her husband walking up the mountain. And another man, who was already on his way back to stand in the same spot, replied that he had seen that Inez ended up going down all alone. Absolutely all of the witnesses who went to the hearing said she was a criminal. But Inez didn't understand why they were all lying because it really wasn't true. She definitely didn't kill Joseph because she was incredibly much in love with him. She was very proud that he was her husband and would never do that to the man she loved. The girl was so much engrossed in various reflections and recollections that she did not even hear the man in the court calling her. Inez immediately woke up and looked in his direction. She said she would never have done any of this, and it was all slander and lies. But Mr. Justice said that the accused not only burned the body of her husband, but also showed vicious character by denying the crime. So the Holy Court, under the auspices of the water goddess Charasi, sentences her to 30 years in Ramfield. And when the girl heard that, she was just crushed. She couldn't believe that it was really true. The people who had gathered around her started shouting and wishing her death, calling her all kinds of names. Everyone was talking about the look on the face of the person who wore out her husband in order to reach out to others. She did such a thing, and now she pretends as if she doesn't know anything. And that is very low of her. This is how Inez ended up in Ramfield, where every day seemed like hell. There she had to eat food thrown to her like dogs, where her body was broken and weary from the hard labor she had to endure every day. In that place, everyone trembled with fear in the face of absolute power. And there her soul, which was incapable of feeling anything else, was dying. Inez realized that she had to cling to life in every way possible. However, these hellish days lasted for 10 whole years, and one day one of the guards was sitting as he always did, watching the prisoners and reading the newspaper. It said that the criminals were receiving a special pardon from the new emperor who had come to the throne. So soon Inez was visited and told that she must accept a new order from the emperor, and in the end she was still undermined by the freedom she longed for and even feared at times to dream of. As soon as the girl stepped outside, she noticed that everything around her was incredibly bright. She was about to leave, but suddenly she heard someone behind her speak to her. It was one of the guards who hadn't treated her very badly. He held out the sheet and said it was for her. The woman, who identified herself as her maid, tearfully asked him to give it to her. The girl looked at him in surprise, then asked if the letter had really come for her. She took it in her hands and looked at it for a while. Then Inez thanked Homer in a trembling voice for his concern, and said that in that case, she would already be going somewhere else. The man, too, had to go to fulfill his duties. He left the girl, who stared at the letter for a while, then plucked up the courage to open it. When she opened the letter, she realized that Susan had not forgotten her, and she wondered what the girl had written there. But as soon as Inez read the contents, it was as if she had been stabbed in the back, because the news that the letter was about simply dumbfounded her. Susan's letter told of her mother's death, as well as the fall of the family and her father's suicide. Once she was out of this hell, a new circle begins, as if someone had been waiting for it, and had specially timed it to release Inez and to plunge her into new misery. Suzanne wrote in a letter that all died because of her, and there's nowhere to return to. The girl was left all alone. She said she had killed absolutely everyone. Her husband, her mother, her father, all those who loved her so much. Suzanne was telling poor Inez, who was already crushed, that it was all because of her. The girl suddenly found it very difficult to breathe, the words hanging over her. She fell to the ground because of her strong emotions. Then she realized that it was too noisy in her head. She ran and asked those voices that were playing in her to stop, because they kept blaming her for the death of her loved ones, and it was just unbearable for her. Inez ran through the forest, despite neither her feet nor her eyes. She wanted some peace and salvation, so she saw a light nearby that began to beckon to her. And so, while the girl was running there, she accidentally tripped over tree roots and fell straight to the ground. Inez just lay there for a while, her whole body trembling, but then she lifted her head and saw the unbelievable. It was a beautiful view of the forest in the distance, and the mountains, and the incredibly beautiful turquoise-colored lake. She couldn't believe her eyes that she would ever be able to see such a beautiful sight again. For a while she just sat there, and then she stood up and realized that this was where it might end. One thought had already formed in her head, so she went straight into the water without even undressing or taking off her shoes. She remembered what Mrs. Hercasia had said, that he who wants too much ends up empty-handed. He who demands too much gets nothing in the end. Inez pushed these thoughts away from her at that moment. When she stepped fully into the water, she was incredibly happy to finally feel it on her thin skin. Well, then she decided to put her plan into action. The girl sank to the bottom of the lake and began to gasp for air because she didn't have enough air in her lungs. Inez twitched her legs as hard as she could and realized that she was making a great mistake. The girl didn't know how she could even come to this decision. She realized that she needed to breathe urgently, so she started to swim upstairs. She couldn't breathe, which made her feel very sick. Inez had endured all those horrible 10 years in an incredibly hard prison, and didn't understand how she could have thought that just like that, she should die in vain once she was released and pardoned at last. The girl began to float to the surface, but at that moment she was swallowing all the water with her mouth in parallel. She realized that there was no fate more miserable than this. Inez could no longer breathe definitively. Then she remembered another of the goddess's words, that if someone reaches out and offers to walk 10 steps, you should give them everything you have. But now the girl realized that the goddess was wrong, because even if she was ready to give absolutely everything, no one would give her a helping hand. At this point, Inez's lungs had already filled up with enough water, so she began to fall to the bottom unconscious. At that moment, however, to the girl's surprise, out of her last strength, she felt someone's touch on her arm. It began to pull her upward. She struggled to open her eyes to see who it was, and saw the silhouette of some man passing air into her lungs with his lips. After a while, when she opened her eyes again, she could breathe calmly. She drew air into her lungs, becoming calmer with each breath. Then she looked around and saw a wet man not far from her, who had apparently rescued her. Inez hadn't been conscious long enough when she was plunged back into her nightmares. The horrible voice that had been accusing her began to haunt her again. She was in a completely dark space where she couldn't hide from it. Then she suddenly saw a small light nearby that called her by name. The girl immediately turned that way and saw this man holding out his hand to her and telling her to go to him. It was all thoughts, and it would save her. Inez, of course, obeyed him and realized that only this man could snap her out of this horrible nightmare. And soon, when the girl touched his hand, she awoke to life as well. For a while longer it was hard for her to think and to look anywhere at all, but then she heard a man's voice calling her. The girl turned to the side and saw the man who had saved her. He held her hand and asked her why she was having such terrible nightmares. Inez was silent for a while, trying to figure out what was going on and where she was, but when she scrutinized the man's face, she wondered if it was really Carson. Gathering all her strength, she managed to sit up on the bed and told him she was fine. Then she wondered if she'd caused trouble again, and thanked him for waking her up. In fact, she was now in the bedroom of Carson von Raymond, Lord of Rossonia. The man said in a sad voice that she should also thank the servants for that, for they had taken care of her all the week she had been unconscious. This man was actually the 8th Prince of the Empire, and also her savior. Inez smiled and said that she was really fine, for since he had saved her life, the seizures had become weaker. In Rothfeld, she had nightmares that were filled with endless darkness. With Carson, however, the darkness was finally dispelled by the light she had been waiting for. Carson said that even though they are weaker, however, the seizures still bother her and he can see that. The girl stood her ground and said she was really normal and he shouldn't worry. The man, however, frowned and said that in that case, he wanted to ask her something, and then inquired if she was so well, why a week ago she had thrown herself thoughtlessly into the lake, though she knew she would die that way. Inez was taken by surprise by this question, for she had never thought about the answer before. She began to feel very anxious, and that voice came over her again. It said over and over again that she was the cause of everyone's death and that she was to blame for everything. The voice kept repeating all the time that she should have fallen to the bottom of the lake, but she couldn't even do that. Inez was tearing up inside. Her head was starting to hurt badly, and that voice was so loud that she couldn't do anything about it. The girl didn't know where it even came from in her head. He kept going on and on about how she should have died and not pulled the whole family down with her. The girl was clothed in darkness. Then she began to answer the man's question, saying that if a man like her were gone, then everything would be resolved for the better. But at that moment, Carson said in a caring voice that if she was having such a hard time, she might as well not say anything. He didn't really want to torture her. He just said a little too much. When the man said those words, he sighed heavily. He realized that she was going through a very difficult time, and his questions were only making things worse. But he also said that there's nothing good in being a narcissist. It would only make things worse, and she would not help herself or others. Inez was silent for a while, and then with tears in her eyes, she asked, what if she was the reason everyone was dead? Her parents, her family, and everyone who was in any way connected to her. But the man replied in a calm voice that even if that was indeed the case, it was better to just move on. She should live. The girl didn't understand how anyone could be so sure of anything at all, but the man began to move away from her. And before he left her room, he said it's all because it's life, and it's up to her to decide exactly what kind of life it's going to be. She makes the decisions in her life, and no one can influence them. Inez was very surprised to hear that this was her life. For half of her life, she had only heard death wishes. Everyone in the court looked her straight in the eye and wished her dead with great hatred. They said that scum like her had no right to live. In that horrible prison, in confinement, she was beaten and told by everyone that she was not worthy of this life, that she was a nobody, and had no right to be in this world. And now it was a great surprise to the girl to know that her purpose wasn't just to die. She didn't even know if she really wanted to live. From that moment, a few more days passed. Inez lay in bed most of the time, building up her strength, and soon, one rainy evening, she went to the cemetery. Absolutely all of her clothes and shoes were completely soaked, however. She soon finally found the overgrowth she had been looking for so long. And so as she stood there and just watched, she realized that after all these years, she couldn't even cry. Joseph Benoit's name was written there, along with the years he had lived, and a single quote about the love that was in his eyes being buried in this place. And Inez thought about how this resentment was just as much about her as it was about her. Everyone around her said she'd killed him. Everyone said she was even starting to feel strange. Then, speaking as if to herself, she asked, "Is it possible that I really killed Joseph?" But then she realized that it was all nonsense. She took off her wedding ring, realizing that now she wanted to get rid of these tormenting thoughts that were eating her up inside. The girl placed the ring on the stone, realizing that she was going to end it with Joseph. It was all for his own peace of mind. At that moment she remembered how happy they had been together, how they had sat on the summer lawn, and he had proposed to her. Joseph called her a beautiful and noble lady, and also said that he was of humble origin, but would still dare to offer her his hand and heart. At that moment the girl was incredibly happy. And now she addressed her dead husband, saying that she would not come here again, and also asked his forgiveness for everything. After that, leaving her wedding ring behind, she just started walking away, realizing that from now on, she wanted to put the past aside in order to live happily, in order to want to finally live. The rain was getting much heavier. Inez threw her hood over her head to keep from getting even wetter, and realized she had to get back to the village before the weather got worse. It's been a long time since then. The city had already turned on the streetlights, for it had become completely dark and impossible to see. The girl walked through the wet and cold, dreary streets and realized that because of the rain, there was absolutely not a living soul on the streets except for her. Inez saw a man not far away from her and realized that someone was there. Looking more closely, Inez suddenly thought that this stranger was Joseph, but she realized that he was dead, and that was purely logically impossible. But she decided to test her theory, so she moved closer to him and asked him to stop for a moment. The man only glanced at her, and after that he just started running away. The girl was very surprised and didn't understand why he was suddenly running away. After all, they had definitely just collided with each other. She stood still for a while and realized that it was definitely not her hallucination or someone passing by. Even after 12 years, she can't recognize him. She's just terribly hurt about it. But somehow her heart told her that this man was really Joseph. Soon, in spite of her terrible health, she ran around the corner and saw that the stranger had stopped. The man just stood there looking at her. And then he said her name with a smile on his face. Inez started to cross the street to get closer and asked Joseph if it was really him and he was alive. She wondered in a trembling voice why he was only showing up now. He'd been alive all this time, but he'd been hiding. But then suddenly the girl stopped, seeing the incredibly horrible and evil smile on his face. Inez was so shocked that she stood in the middle of the driveway and didn't understand why he was smiling. Well, at that moment, the girl had no time to think, turned her head sideways, because she heard some strange sounds, and saw that a huge horse with a wagon was flying right at her. And in that second, she was lying on the sidewalk nearby, bloody. Joseph, who was the love of her life, just stood there and watched her die. Inez couldn't even move or say a word. She didn't realize it had happened at all, but she was in so much pain that she could hardly lift her arm. The girl did it so that Joseph would help her. However, he in turn called her an idiot and said that she was too tenacious. The girl, when she heard this, was very surprised, but the man came closer to her and said he was sorry she couldn't die the first time. Then he handed over a bag of big money for the man who hit her and said the guy did good after all. Good job. Inez watched in amazement, not knowing what he was doing. Then Joseph bent down in front of her and told her that he had even become a dead man to send her to Romfield. However, he had no idea that she would be released this early. He sighed heavily and said that this was incredibly annoying because he thought he was finally rid of her. Seeing her look, which was filled with wonder, from the guests, he asked if she really thought she looked that good like that. And then with a smile on her face, she said that if she thought it was unfair, she would get revenge, if she could do it at all. Inez was bleeding very badly, so everything in front of her was already a blur. The girl thought that it didn't make sense, because it was all because of him, but she didn't understand why he had thrown her into this hell. She also couldn't believe that he had never truly loved her in her life, and yet he was so, it turned out, genuinely able to fake it. The girl turned her head to the side and realized that she couldn't die then, but apparently it was her destiny to meet this kind of end. After those words from Carson, she thought, everything would be all right now. And in that moment, she really realized that she didn't want to die like that at all. She wants to live a happy life without the horrible Joseph who set her up and trampled on her feelings. And at that moment, the girl saw a huge light that was coming closer and closer. She did not resist it. And the second that light consumed her consciousness completely, she suddenly opened her eyes. The girl was breathing very hard and couldn't understand where she was or what had happened to her. She remembered that she had been hit by a carriage, and that was certain. But at that moment, a woman suddenly addressed her. Inez turned her head to the side and saw that it was her mother. The girl was very surprised. She realized that it was probably just a dream, because she remembered that her mother had died. However, the one in turn crouched down and began wiping the sweat from the girl's face, asking where she had even gone in such a heavy rain. Inez looked at her through her tears and realized that this was her first meeting with her mother in these terrible 10 years. Then she turned to her mother in a trembling voice and, apologizing, said she was incredibly sorry that it had happened like this. But the woman, in turn, got up and said that since she understood everything, she should stop crying, because it didn't look like the fever was going down, and she was only making it worse with her tears. The woman started to leave the room, saying she would get some water for her, to bring down her temperature just a little. Inez, hearing this, immediately objected. She started to get out of bed, begging her not to leave her, for she didn't want to wake up from this dream. She was finally able to see her mother and missed her so much. But the moment she got out of bed, she was suddenly very surprised, because when she looked at her leg, she saw that there was absolutely nothing wrong with her ankle. Inez was very surprised, for ever since she had begun to limp, she had always been in incredible pain even in her sleep, and that made her uneasy. But the girl, without thinking long, immediately ran towards her mother, asking her to stop. She wanted to make sure that she really saw her, even if it was in a dream. But the moment she ran past the mirror, she immediately stopped beside it and fell to the ground in surprise. Mother, who heard the screams, immediately ran up to her and asked her if everything was all right, and also inquired why she had gotten out of bed so abruptly, for she was still quite weak. Inez, horrified, examined her reflection in the mirror and realized that she had looked like this when she was 20 years old, and to the touch everything was completely realistic, not like it had been before, in her dreams. She looked around and realized that her mother was chewing her face like she had when she was younger, and a healthy ankle, all of which could only point to one thing. So the girl immediately turned to her mom and asked how old she was turning this year. The woman was a little surprised at this kind of question, but then said that she would be 39 by now, and asked her daughter why it was that she was suddenly interested in this. But Inez, when she heard this, concluded that in that case she was really 20 years old, and she realized that this was no dream at all. She somehow, after the accident, was able to go back a full 12 years into the past. Soon after the girl recovered, then immediately she had an appointment with Joseph, and he, as he sat at tea with her, said that today she was somehow different from usual, and wondered if she was not interested. Inez looked at the man completely disdainfully, and realized that this was the commoner who was able to somehow become a knight due to his outstanding skills. This is the poor guy who was killed by his wife a year after their wedding, and the man who betrayed her by killing her. But now she was past that. So she said with a smile that she wasn't at all, and she was really very interested. The girl needed to avoid arousing strong suspicions. Joseph suddenly felt uncomfortable and put his head down and asked her not to lie. After all, if she really wasn't interested, he could stop talking about it. But Inez said that was not true. She had been waiting all day for him to come, and when the man heard that, he glowed with joy, and asked if she could spare some time for him at her upcoming birthday party. The girl, when she heard this, shuddered. She realized that on her 20th birthday he had proposed to her, and at that moment his well-thought-out play had truly begun. Now, however, the girl smiled and said that she would definitely try to find some time for him. Joseph was satisfied with this answer and said that he was very grateful, and added that he would have important things to do now, so he would be on his way. Inez at that moment thought about the fact that he was about to stand up, take a few steps, turn around and say one very important thing. And that's exactly what he did. The man said he wanted to tell her on her birthday, but he can't help himself. He became a knight in the Earl's family. That time, in a past life, the girl was so excited that she got up and ran up to Joseph, feeling proud of him and forgetting the difference in status. She then started hugging him with all her heart and talking about how incredible he really is. But it was different now. Inez smiled demurely and said that he was doing a great job, and now he could go quickly, for things were getting busy. The man was a little surprised at this reaction, for he had expected it to be more sincere. And then he wondered if she didn't even want to know in what family he had become a knight. The girl said that he had become a highly honored knight, and in which family, it's not so important. In any case, it's a good job that deserves praise, which she basically did. In fact, Joseph was knighted in the family of Earl Greymane of Rysonia, not a family that favors commoners. So the girl even to this day wonders how he even managed to get there, because if you think about it, it is quite strange. Then suddenly the man asked what she was thinking about, for her face became incredibly serious. Inez said, smiling, that it was nothing of the sort, and he should be leaving altogether. Rather, you see, it was not good to be late. The man was very wary and asked in a sad voice why she was doing him that day, so she was trying to escort him. The girl explained that it was because she had a lot of thoughts in her head about her upcoming birthday. Joseph said that he was clear, but he was not really satisfied with this answer. However, He had to turn around and leave so as not to arouse suspicion. And so, when the girl was alone, she put the cup on the saucer with great force, her whole body trembling. She grabbed a knife that was lying nearby and pointed it in Joseph's direction, thinking about how she incredibly wanted to kill him right now. But at that moment she dropped it to the ground, realizing that would be too stupid of her. Can't let him go so easily and with impunity, of course. Inez is going to break him this time, so he'll just beg for death. This very time in the Imperial Palace, Carson, who was still quite young as well, the guy came and immediately bowed, turning to His Majesty and said that it was already time for him to leave the imperial family. When his father heard this, he was very surprised and said that his son must be a very mature guy. He confirmed this and said that he was already 21 years old, so it was time. But at that moment his wife turned to the man and said something about Ladhil. The man immediately realized what she was talking about. So he turned to his wife and said that what the Empress meant was that there was precisely no son in the lands of Ladhil to inherit the lineage, and he thought it would be a pretty good idea for him to take the place of the local lord. When Carson heard this, he agreed with them, and the woman in turn said something about Risonia. Then the emperor, smiling, said that he could take his little sister out of Risonia if he so desired. When the guy heard this, he bowed once more and thanked them for their mercy, and told them to praise the Kate's empire. Soon after he left the hall and realized that the Empress was still using the Emperor as her personal carrier pigeon. This annoyed him greatly, and the man who calls himself a father doesn't even know how his own children are doing. It's been 5 years since Louisiana was taken to Risonia. Carson was so angry he was ready to punch someone, because he was a fool too, thinking he knew Louis, but she didn't even have anything to remember them by. One fine rainy day, Ness was having lunch with her family at the big table as usual. She watched her mother and father having fun talking about something, and it was still impossible for the girl to believe that she had really gone back in time and her parents were alive and well. Then suddenly her mother looked at her and, turning to her husband, asked if he thought Inez was a little strange lately. This child who talked for days on end became so taciturn. The man asked what was so strange about it. He said she was just getting older and calmer. She shouldn't worry about it too much. After all, it's only natural. He was like that too. Inez, smiling, reassured her mother, saying that her father was indeed right. She is the same as she has always been. However, the woman wanted to object to something, citing events that had happened recently. But her father interrupted her and asked why all this worry was necessary. Then he decided to change the subject, and turning to his daughter, asked if she had heard the new news yet. And without waiting for a reply from the girl, he said that a new lord was coming to Landhill. In fact, Swindon was originally a small territory on the outskirts of Risonia, but after the innovation that occurred due to the Great Flood 35 years ago, the entering way divided the territory, returning Swindon to Landhill. All the while, however, Risonia continued to gradually aid their territories. That's why they still do business with them. However, since they are also Landhill lands, they have to be careful. Father said that this person is Lord 8th Prince. His name is Carlson von Ryman. And when the girl heard this, she couldn't even eat the piece of meat she had cut off for herself. She was very surprised that it was really him. She could not believe that he had really become a lord. Then Inez asked her father when the new lord would visit Sweden. The mother, in turn, said that it would be in about 3 days, because he still had to get there and rest a little from the road. After all, the way is not close. When the girl heard this, she realized that she would be meeting him in 3 days already. She knew she wouldn't be able to cross paths with him at this birthday party, and that made her sad. But suddenly the father said that he would also stop at Risonia on the way. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised and asked why this was so. At this point, his mother had already spoken and said that he would do so in order to escort the princess, who resided at Risonia Castle, to Landhill. When his father heard this, he said he remembered it and asked his wife if it was true that Lord Risoni was betrothing the princess. Inez, hearing this, was very surprised. She remembered the moments of her past life when she was in prison. She had managed to cross paths with this girl. She said if she kills this girl, he'll spare her Jason. If she kills her, it'll be okay. Inez looked at her in surprise and couldn't understand what was happening to her, but her eyes looked possessed. And the woman said she killed a member of the imperial family. She killed that idiot. killed a member of the imperial family, and she kept repeating it, holding a red ribbon. The girl was very surprised to see this memory in her head. She didn't understand why she suddenly thought of Lena. Inez couldn't believe that the member of the imperial family she was referring to could be Carson's younger sister. The girl, of course, realized that you couldn't trust everything she said, because Lena wasn't in her right mind either. However, if what she said was really true, then it was just awful. Soon after dinner, the girl returned to her room. Then someone knocked at her door. It was the maid, and she asked if she could come in for a while. Inez was a little surprised, but said that of course she could. Then the maid came in and said that a letter had come for her from Sir Joseph. The girl was very much surprised to hear this, but then she took it in her hand to read it. It said something about him wishing her a happy birthday and asking to see her on that day. Inez, after reading this letter, turned to Susan, who was her maid, and inquired whether Joseph was not too insolent. The girl was very frightened, and then surprised, asked if there was anything strange in the letter, but the lady, in her turn, said that a man must have some manners, and she asked how that knight of the commoners dared to call her by her first name. At that moment she crumpled that piece of paper and thought about the fact that not only had he set her up and sent her to prison, he had also killed her. She should have gotten out of that hell. So he also laughed as he watched her die, bleeding to death, and was only too happy about it. She was incredibly angry and thought about how she would take revenge and kill him for sure, and if he was gone she could finally live in peace. Inez was silent for a while, and then told Suzanne to start by telling him that she was willing to do it. The maid bowed at once and said she would do it. As she started to walk out, Inez thought about the fact that surely Joseph's death would not put an end to all the troubles. After all, he had forced so many people to give false testimony at the trial, and that was not something an ordinary commoner knight could pull off. He's definitely got someone with the right level of ability behind him. If the girl avoids Joseph, he'll use other means. So Inez is strictly determined to find out who is behind all of this, and give it all back to him in full. If she doesn't fight back, she won't be able to create a perfect world for her life and enjoy what she has. The girl was going to make a perfect world for herself, and to do that, she had to first deal with all the problems that were present. In fact, Carlson von Raymond is the man who saved a girl from life, and the only one who lent a hand in a life that was like hell. This was her savior, and his mere existence was already bringing Inez closer to a perfect world. When evening came, the girl still had to meet Joseph. She was in the same place as last time, at a small table in the garden. The man, as soon as he arrived, immediately bowed, said hello, and told her that he had missed her. She smiled and said she was very happy to see him too. The girl added that they were pretty lucky, as the rain finally stopped and they were able to meet outside. Joseph at this moment began to take a piece of paper out of his pocket, saying that he had written a letter for her. The girl in turn asked him if he would read it aloud. The man blushed a little, but said that of course he wanted to convey to her all his feelings and emotions he was experiencing. Inez already knew all those words perfectly well by heart. It said if she remembered how they'd first met, her golden hair shining like moonlight in the dark night sky, the sight of her green eyes taking his breath away, and from that very moment he loved her, yes, absolutely. Inez knew those words so well because she read the letter every day, and in that time she had already learned them. Then he put the sheet aside and started pulling something out of his pocket again, saying that this was why he wanted to ask if she would take his hand and heart, or break it apart. He immediately got down on one knee and held out for the girl the engagement ring he had spent quite a long time choosing. Inez, when she saw this, pretended to be very surprised, but then she got up from her seat and just slammed that little ring box shut. The girl also turned to Joseph and asked him to get up. The man, when he saw all this, was very surprised and asked if she was refusing him now. She said that it was probably true. The man in turn asked in surprise why she refused, since he thought they loved each other. But Inez calmly explained that she had received a marriage proposal that day. When he heard this, he was very surprised and asked what kind of proposal she was talking about, and more importantly, from whom. But she said that her parents had received a wedding proposal from another noble family. However, he need not worry. She would definitely refuse them. When the guy heard this, he was immediately happy. But the girl also didn't have it so easy. She said that she needed a little time, because he himself knows that the father will not give them a solution. Then she asked him if he understood the gravity of the situation. Joseph bowed and asked how long he would have to wait. Inez replied that she unfortunately didn't know that. Then she said that for sure, until her mother and father accepted their love. The man in turn had already risen from his knees. Then she came closer to him and said that, on second thought, he was in the Earl's family and should be well served. If he got the title of baronet, his father would approve of their union, and they could be betrothed as soon as possible. But Joseph got very upset and said that there is no way he can earn it, because there is not even a war anywhere right now. So he will definitely not be able to show himself on the battlefield to be given the title. Inez in turn made a very surprised expression on her face, and asked if he was then going to let her live as a commoner's wife. She also said that if he really wanted to marry her, he would have to try for that too. Joseph was silent for a while. Then the girl realized that in order to move things along, she had to push him. Inez knew that someone was in charge of Joseph, and that someone had made a commoner of nothing into a knight of the Earl's family, capable of a high title. This person pressured the court to falsely accuse her of murdering her husband. And when her family was destroyed because of these false accusations, this person was able to make a big profit for himself. So the girl looked at her lover in surprise and asked why he didn't answer anything, or if his words of great love for her were just lies. Joseph answered nothing. Then the girl turned around and, starting to leave, said that in that case she could not accept his proposal, even after a while. She realized that this man who was twirling the lad left and right could only be Earl Graham. And then, as she was about to leave Joseph, he suddenly came over, grabbed her hand, and told her that it wasn't like that at all. The girl was very surprised when she saw his firm grip, but immediately snatched her hand away and said that it was perfectly natural, for he really loved her very much. The man confirmed this information, but then Inez said that this time she would try to put off talking about marriage as long as possible. However, if there are more proposals, she will have no choice. She will not be able to influence her parents in any way. Joseph was about to reply something, but she interrupted him, took his ring, and said she would keep it for now, for he probably wouldn't mind. In fact, she thought that when things got back to normal, the ring would even be a huge symbol of victory, which is why she's taking it. The girl turned around and, leaving, said that this was the end of the conversation, because soon they would have to go to dinner, so it was time for them to leave. Inez turned around and suddenly remembered that she had forgotten to tell him something. She asked him if he considered himself a man of humble origins. When Joseph heard this, he was very surprised and asked what she even meant by these words. They did not take their eyes off each other for some time, but after that, Inez just smiled, turned around, and walked away without saying a word to him. From that moment, some more time passed, and at last the day came when Carlson was to arrive, and Inez was ready and on her way with Susan to meet him. The girl said that the maidservants should hurry, for the prince would be arriving in the main square of Rissonia very soon. Susan in turn looked up and turned to the lady, and wondered how she could even know about this passageway. For even she, as someone who works on this estate and goes to every corner, did not know of its existence. Inez, without stopping, replied that she had just been to this place before. In fact, they were already in a prison, where people nearby were pounding stones as a sign that they were serving their sentences. When the maid heard that the mistress had been to this place before, she asked in surprise how that could have happened. But Inez replied that it had been a long time ago, so it didn't matter. Susan decided not to insist, and to change the subject. She said she was actually a little surprised, because she didn't think the girl would want to go see Prince Carlson live. Inez smiled and asked, "Is this all because of a fool who never wanted to know anyone but Joseph, and suddenly she's interested in someone else?" The maid suddenly felt a little uncomfortable, and said she didn't mean that at all. But in fact her surprise was quite natural, Inez thought. It was because Joseph had proposed to her 3 days ago, and he hadn't contacted her since. She felt bad about that, because she didn't know what he was planning. But she quickly dismissed those thoughts, realizing that she needed to get in the mood to meet Carlson, because that was far more important at the moment. The girl remembered that he was currently 21 years old, and she even wondered what he looked like now, being still such a young man. Some time passed, and Carlson, who had arrived with an escort of some guards, finally pulled into the prison grounds. He thought about the fact that he would be able to pick up Louis and meet her in person after such a long time. The man realized it was taking him a little longer than he expected, but better late than never. In fact, when Carlson was 15 years old, their mother died, the cause of death being long accumulated poisons in the body. Everyone in the imperial family knew exactly who the poison belonged to, but at the same time pretended to be completely unaware of who was to blame for all of this. The reality that he had to remain silent about his mother's death reminded him relentlessly of his helplessness in such situations. And when he got a little older and turned 17, his little sister was taken away from him as well. When this was about to be done, Carlson ran out into the main square and asked the Count what kind of education it was that she had to be taken so far away, and that too at such a young age. The girl wanted to turn to her brother, to run up to him and hug him to comfort her, but the man held her hand firmly and said there was no time for all that. She started crying loudly because she was incredibly sad. Then the man said that he thought she was as smart as Prince Carlson, but apparently he was wrong. She looked at the man and couldn't believe he really felt that way. After all, she had tried her best to be smart and obedient like they wanted her to be. At this point, Carlson stepped forward and hid his little sister behind his back and told him not to dare to act like that ever again. He also added that if that man even laid a finger on the Empress's relative, he wouldn't just let it go. The man only laughed and said he had no idea why they were suddenly having such thoughts. He also said that it was all because Her Majesty the Empress, filled with parental love, had personally asked for the princess's education so that the girl would have the best of everything. He also waved his hand and asked if he was saying all this because he was related to the Empress. Carlson was incredibly angry and told the man to shut up immediately. Then he turned around and said that it would be much better not to use such vulgar language. Then he looked at the little girl, who was trembling, and told the princess to follow him. But after that he looked already at the boy, asking if they were now going to both go against the Empress's words, and if so, they would regret it. He sighed heavily and said he didn't even understand how a brat like Carlson could keep anyone in his life at all. Guy at this point turned to his sissy Louis and said that he would be sure to pick her up very soon. The girl, though still a little girl, already understood everything. She held out her little finger for the promise and asked him to hurry up and do it. Carlson smiled, for he really loved his sister very much, and shook his little finger and said that he promised he would do it. And the moment his only little sister was taken from him, he began saving money to build up his strength, and all the money he set aside was earned honestly. And that's what helped stabilize his precarious position in society. Those who used to look down on him were forced to bow their heads. He continued to make money, and in time became the owner of a huge capital. So when he was 21 years old, he already had quite a good amount of power and capital. Soon he arrived at the right place, and the woman who sat sipping her wine asked if he really wanted to become Lord of Landhell. Carson in turn said that this species is pretty close to Rizonia, so he doesn't see any problems. But the woman said it's quite interesting because he refuses to give up the throne and won't even give money. The man said he didn't think this deal would be at a loss to her at all. It's pretty much a win-win for everyone. For a while they just stared at each other. Then the woman turned away and said that it was fine after all. She would pass on his suggestion to His Majesty. He had worked hard all this time after all, so he deserved to be heard. Carson said he'd be on his way and thanked her, then walked out the door. Then he set out on another journey to fetch his sister, purposefully. One of the attendants suddenly came up to him and said that they would probably arrive at the right place very soon. He also said it was pretty quick considering it only took 4 days to prepare. Carson in turn smiled and asked what those mere 4 days were compared to 4 years. Inez in turn followed the maid as they continued walking, and she asked her if many people had gathered to get a glimpse of the prince. Susan said, of course, because among the princes he is the most famous, so quite a few people gathered. The girl also said with admiration that he had achieved a lot since he was still young, and his handsome face contributed to his popularity. And that's why the popularity of the prince is certainly no joke, and every girl probably has at least one portrait of him, of course. The big fans have a lot more. Inez thought for a moment, then asked if she could get one for her too. Susan looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted his portrait. Mistress said that since others have it, she also wants one, because she needs a small size of the palm of her hand is enough for her. Susan was very surprised, but smiling, she said that she would look in the market in that case. Since she was so interested in the prince, she could not refuse. But at that moment, as they were passing by, they suddenly heard some strange noise around the corner. Inez immediately ran over to check what was going on and saw people standing nearby. She saw some woman standing there yelling at a guy who was all in prison uniforms. She immediately recognized who the woman was. It was just Lena, who was talking about wanting to kill a member of the imperial family. Inez was now very surprised and frightened, for she was certainly not the one she had expected to meet, even though she was now very different from the crazy woman from Romfeld. But it was definitely Lena. The man in turn said that it would be the last time, he assured her. The girl suddenly became a little nervous. It was obvious that she was uncomfortable talking to him, and that she had doubts. But then suddenly Inez was distracted from peeking and said they had to go faster. She immediately realized she couldn't stand, so she followed the maid. But she was still wondering what Lena was doing in a place like this. And what kind of man was this man standing next to her anyway? She had so many questions, but unfortunately she didn't know the answer to them. Some time passed, and the girls finally emerged from the underground tunnels into the street, where a great many people had already gathered to meet the prince. In fact, in Romfeld, Lena said that she killed a member of the imperial family in Rezona, which means that some kind of assassination is going to happen very soon. If we're talking about a princess from the imperial family, she was probably talking about Carson's younger sister. And since the man is taking his little sister to another town, that's the day Lena is going to kill the poor princess. Inez realized that things were very bad, and she needed to think of something, needed to tell someone about it so they would take some action. But then suddenly, a wave of doubt came over the girl, and she knew that probably no one would believe her words. And she might be wrong, even became physically sick with it all. Her hands were shaking, but she realized that if she ruined everything again, it would be incredibly bad. Suddenly, a woman approached her from behind and, apologizing, asked if she could pass. Inessa immediately moved aside and allowed her to step forward. However, when the girl passed by, Inez recognized her immediately. She had black hair, golden eyes, and she looked exactly like Carson. She immediately realized that it was the princess. However, she was accompanied at that moment by an elderly woman who told the girl that she should go on her way and not stop, because she had been distracted by something in passing. Inez also heard the woman call her princess, and she could definitely verify that it was baby girl, indeed Carson's little sister. So, lest a big mistake be made that would cause an innocent girl to lose her life, she immediately ran after them and shouted after them to stop. But it was all to no avail. The people in the crowd overshadowed her voice and didn't even let the girl pass normally. Sometime later, when she managed to get out onto the roadway, the guard stopped her and told her that the procession had already started, so she couldn't get closer. And at that moment, Inez turned her head and saw that indeed, a great many wagons and just men on horseback were passing by. Carson was ahead of them all, of course. The man looked very serious, but also incredibly handsome. He rode forward, knowing his goal and wanting to meet his little sister as soon as possible. Inessa from her seat could also see his younger sister with an older woman who was talking to the guard. She didn't know what to do. Wasn't sure when Lena might show up and make a huge mistake. She realized that if she didn't report the danger as soon as possible, innocent people would get hurt. But suddenly people began to whisper around her, not realizing who it was that was passing by. They tried to get closer to get a closer look at who it was there, but the guards immediately ran up to the unfamiliar horse and the man who was sitting on it, and questioned who it was in general. But the girl who was sitting on the horse did not stop. The man then ran straight out to her and said that if she did not get out of the way now, he would have to use force. The woman with the long white hair didn't listen to him at all, but only roused her horse and ran straight ahead. She saw her goal, so she wasn't going to stop. The man in turn swung around to stop, but it was no use, for she had already galloped forward and he had no time to do anything. Inez, when she saw her hood come off, immediately recognized the girl. Of course it was Lena, as she had expected. Then she turned the other way and saw the girl bearing straight for the poor princess who was waiting for her brother. Inez ran realizing there was nothing more she could do to change the future. She must protect the little girl, so she tore and scooped up Louisiana, pushing her away from that crazy horse and the frantic Lena. Then there was a huge loud pop. Blood spurted from somewhere, and the ribbons came loose from the little girl's hair. There was chaos all around, people screaming, fussing, not realizing what had happened. Inez, for her part, was lying on the ground, hugging a little girl. One shoe came off her foot and she suddenly felt an incredible pain in that place, but she held back her screams so as not to frighten the little girl. There was also a little bleeding on her forehead. Then she looked at Louisiana and asked the princess if she was okay. The little girl looked at her with a frightened look, tears in her eyes. She was trembling, but she didn't say anything, just waved her head. Then Inez helped her sit up and told her that she shouldn't worry, because everything would be fine now. She was saved, so there was no need to worry. At that very time, the horse was finally calmed down, and Lena, who was leading it, was being detained. The woman screamed and said that they couldn't stop her, but the guard said that she wouldn't get away with it. When Lena looked at Inez and screamed loudly, calling her an idiot and saying that if it wasn't for her, that girl would be dead by now. The girl looked at her in surprise. Louisiana continued to tremble. Then she hugged her and told the princess not to listen to her. It was okay now. She was safe. She shouldn't have to get into all this adult squabbling. She got to her feet and, taking the girl's hand, told her to go to the prince as soon as possible and added that she would see her off just in case. But as soon as Inessa got to her feet, she suddenly felt very strange. She was losing her balance, for her eyes were blurring. She realized it would be too dangerous if she passed out on the way. But that was okay, because she'd helped Carson anyway, because he'd saved her in a previous life. She took Louisiana by the hand, and they went straight to her brother. The girl realized that if it were not for Carson, she would have died without knowing anything about her terrible lover. He who wants too much will end up empty-handed, but he who wants to live too much will find his salvation. At that moment, her eyes became dizzy, and she began to fall. But she was very lucky that Carlson, who was looking for his sister, came out and grabbed her hand. The man looked her straight in the eye and asked if she was all right, because she didn't look so good. Inez stared at him in surprise for a while, then said his name, but then suddenly realized that she needed to explain. She bowed and said that the princess was almost hurt, but afterwards she immediately lost consciousness because the blow was too strong. At night, Carlson was walking through the corridors of his estate and realized that he should have left the imperial palace, and immediately a similar thing happened. This really annoyed and surprised him. The man realized that if it weren't for that mysterious girl, Louisiana would have lost her small and innocent life that day. He, when he saw a whole horse running at his little sister, immediately rushed toward her, but he was suddenly flanked by some men in uniform and with guns, preventing him from passing. Carlson got very angry and asked what they were even doing and told them to get out of his way immediately. However, one of the men said that they could not do that, for they were only following orders. The man got very angry and thought of nothing else to do but to figure it out on his own. Of course, it would take more time, but it would be effective. So at that moment, Carlson jumped off his horse and ran to attack one of the boys. Of course, he had expected that the Empress wouldn't be able to let him go so easily, but he didn't understand how she even dared to touch Louis, the most precious thing he even had. It wasn't long before he was dealing with all the people who had surrounded him. Then he remembered his little sister, and turned to look in the direction she was, and saw her walking with a woman. Carson at that moment was very surprised that she had survived at all. Then he went straight toward her and didn't know who it was, not an acquaintance, but he realized she wasn't evil. Her face was completely unfamiliar to him, and he realized that this was definitely the first time they were seeing each other. She looked like she was about to fall, and that made him uneasy. But the moment their gazes crossed, the boy realized that she was like a perfect creature. He simply had no words to describe the feelings he experienced at that moment. However, this had never happened before. Carson soon came to the room, and when he quietly opened the door, he saw the girl lying unconscious on the bed with her wounds bandaged. He stepped in closer and realized that she seemed younger to him now than when she was bleeding and completely covered in mud. Back then, the atmosphere on the street was completely different. However, he didn't understand why she was willing to sacrifice her life for Louis, since he didn't even know her at all. But at that moment, Inez suddenly began to open her eyes. She stared at one point for a while, and then she looked at the man standing next to her. He in turn smiled and said that she had finally woken up, and added that he was happy to welcome her. Inez immediately sat up on the bed. She looked at Prince Carson and wondered if it was really him. Then she looked around and wondered where she was. He sat down beside her in the chair that was standing and said that this was Lord Letfield's castle. She fainted, so he rushed her to safety. Inez continued to stare in surprise. In fact, she'd thought for sure she was going to die this time. But now she realized that even in this life, Carson had somehow saved her. But at that moment, the girl also realized that the kind of hallucination she had seen before she finally lost consciousness turned out to be no hallucination at all. Where did the water come from? But it was probably just a play of her imagination. She pondered for a while. Then she asked the man if the princess was all right. Carson sighed heavily and said that it was all thanks to her. She had just come in, but the girl was still asleep, so Louis quickly left. When Inez heard that, she was immediately relieved. She smiled and said that she was very glad to hear that, and added that in that case, she should go back to the mansion. She just sat there for a while. After that, she started to get up. But as soon as she got to her feet, she felt a very strong pain in her ankle. Good thing Carson was able to react in time. Otherwise, she would have fallen to the ground again. The man became very angry at her negligent behavior, and shouting said that she had lost too much blood. So she should not get up, for otherwise she would get dizzy. He also said that the doctor said that everything would be fine, but advised not to overexert himself for a while. Inez didn't argue, because she really felt awful and couldn't even take a step, so she climbed back into bed. When Carson heard this, he exhaled with relief, for he had been worried that she would get stubborn, and she certainly couldn't have that. Then, seeing her bandaged leg, he said that it must be very painful now. However, if she rested for a few days, she would be able to walk again without any problems. The doctor examined her carefully and said that there was no fracture, but just a severe bruise and sprain. Inez sighed heavily when she heard this and said that she understood now. They were silent for a while. The man just watched as she looked sadly at her wounded body. Carson didn't understand why one would feel so uncomfortable in the presence of this girl. She turned to him. Inez wondered what had happened to the woman who had ridden on horseback then and tried to kill the princess. He was a little surprised at her question. Then he said that her identity was difficult to establish and that she was being held in custody so that she wouldn't run away and do something stupid. Inez, hearing this, became wary, and then thought about the fact that it was definitely Lena, given what she'd heard back then in prison, that the customer was Lord Risoni, specifically Earl Greyholm. She realized that it would be advantageous for her and Carson if it turned out that it was this count who was behind the assassination attempt on the members of the imperial family. Therefore, the girl could not miss such a great chance in any case. She was silent for a while, and then she asked the man if she could somehow meet this girl and talk. Carson looked at her in surprise and wondered why she was even doing this. He really didn't understand. But Inez, in turn embarrassed, looked away from him and said that this girl just seemed very familiar to her. The man suspected nothing and said that this girl was in a dungeon and maybe she would find out who she was. Inez said she'd have to take another look at her to tell for sure, because the shock might make her think poorly and mix up more. There was an awkward silence between them for a while. Then the girl began to pull back and said that if it couldn't be done, she wouldn't insist. Carson didn't understand how on earth she could want to meet the man who had almost killed her, and he knew there was something suspicious about her. Well, then he rose from his seat and, smiling, said that if that was what she really wanted, he would allow her to visit the dungeon. Inez couldn't believe what she had just heard, so she asked again, was he really letting her? But the man turned around and started to walk away, saying that he would think about it some more and then tell his decision. The girl asked one last time and said it was very important, so she hoped he would agree. But before he left, Carson stopped and said that he had already explained the situation to Viscount Wendon, so she needn't worry. She could stay at the manor until she got better. When she heard this, she was very surprised and asked, "Did he really tell this whole situation to his father?" But the boy didn't hear it anymore. He left and closed the door behind him. Inez sat smiling at that moment. She couldn't believe that she had just been locked up, just like Lena, with better conditions, of course. But still, a whole week had passed since then. Carlson sat in his office in the afternoon, as usual, dealing with mountains of papers. In fact, the woman they arrested still hasn't confessed. She kept claiming that she was drugged and doesn't remember anything, that she was not herself at that moment, so it's not fair to accuse her like that. And unfortunately, the men who attacked Carson were never identified. They searched all the bodies, but they were never identified. He sighed heavily and realized that, of course, nothing was done easily. But still, this issue bothered him a lot, and he would be glad to solve it as soon as possible, and without additional difficulties. And besides, he's also worried about Inez. From what he had learned, she was the only daughter of the Viscount and a very ordinary girl who was unremarkable. And that's why the fact that she saved the little princess's life still surprises him. But also the indifferent attitude to the pain she's in. Her look as if she's been through many hardships that have only hardened her character, but she's still so young. So he doesn't know what happened to her.